always hate to break this up. This is a good thing that we have such a great community here. I am going to invite you to slowly meander your way to your seats. There's so many great people here. Continue this. Continue this after service, too. Oh, that was great. Well done, everybody. Well, good morning. Hello. If I haven't met you before, my name's Audrey. I'm one of the pastors here, and I get to share with you this morning. Very excited. We are in the series of Acts, and I get to take the next chapter, which happens to be Acts 25. Now, I hope that this series has been helpful for you. It's been quite helpful for me in understanding a bit more about the origins of kind of where our church came from and how we express our faith today. I hope you've had the same experience. I hope it's also been helpful in understanding kind of how similar our Christian brothers and sisters were to us today. We face a lot of the same challenges. If you haven't been able to follow along, I encourage you to do so, to go back and kind of view some of the older messages. They're all online. But I will say no skipping ahead, because that's cheating. So today, we're going to be in Acts 25. And so if you've brought your Bible, go ahead and turn there. And we'll also have some verses on the screen. So, as we're jumping into Acts, I'm going to provide a little bit of a recap, because I always find a recap helpful. We are learning about Acts is really a historical log of Paul's journey, his missionary journeys, and kind of the early church establishment right after Jesus had gone up to heaven. And so Paul was one of the key players in establishing that early Christian church. So Acts is heavily documenting his journeys, and he's been on quite a few missionary journeys to help plant churches around the known world. And I have a map that shows kind of his journeys around this area. This was the hot spot of the known world at that time. And personally, I think we should do like a church trip around here, because this hits like Macedonia and Greece, and that just sounds beautiful to me. So Paul has already gone up through the bottom there of Asia and over to Macedonia, and he's sailed his way back past Cyprus, which if you ever Google Cyprus, looks absolutely heavenly. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous village or island. That's why I think we should go there. And then he's now down, you see where Judea is on the far right, he's down in a town called Caesarea Maritima. Caesarea Maritima. Now, at the time, there was actually two Caesareas, because people like to put their names on things, and one guy wanted his own town named Caesarea, even though there was already one. But where we are today is Caesarea Maritima. And we are currently catching up with Paul in prison. Paul is currently in prison in Caesarea Maritima under the authority of the Romans. Now, as we read about last week, Governor Felix was the one who put Paul there. And he put Paul there because Felix couldn't seem to just make a decision about what he wanted to do with Paul. So he just kept Paul in prison for 2 years. No big deal. Just kept him in prison. Not ideal, but it does say that Felix did allow Paul extra freedom during those 2 years, and that Paul was allowed to receive visitors and accept any aid they brought him. So it wasn't an entirely horrible experience for Paul, especially since there were actually people trying to kill him outside of the prison, Jewish leaders plotting to take his life. And so he was kind of safe, but he was still in prison. He was still in chains. He was unable to pursue or complete his mission, which, if we remember from Acts 23, was to preach the good news in Rome. That was Paul's mission. No matter what was thrown at him, Paul had one thing on his mind, and that was to get to Rome so he could preach there as God had told him he would. Currently, though, Paul is stuck. Paul's stuck in prison, all due to the indecisiveness of old fickle Felix. So Acts 24 ends with a little bit of a cliffhanger. We are introduced to someone new on the scene. So we read about that together in Acts 24:27, the very last verse, and then we'll move on into Acts 25. After 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded in office by Porcius Festus. And wishing to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison there. Just left him there. Felix's last accomplishment on his way out of office was to do nothing. And as we talked about last week, his love for convenience outweighed any of his convictions. And so that's it for Felix. He is out of the story, off the scene. His time is done, and he moves on to his next assignment. So now we pick up at the beginning of Acts 25. We're given an introduction in this very first chapter to this new government, Porcius Festus, and he's a new person in charge who ultimately is going to be deciding what happens to Paul next. So let's read in verse 1. 3 days after Festus arrived in Caesarea to take over his new responsibilities, he left for Jerusalem. 3 days, not 2 years, 3 days, Festus gets to work. Now that's a drastically different approach than his predecessor. He steps right into the unresolved issues of his province, and here is where the Jewish leaders meet him because they see this as an opportunity to win him over to their side. New man they can hopefully sway in their favor. The leading priests and other Jewish leaders met with him and made their accusations against Paul. Surprise, surprise. You know, if there's one thing to say about Pharisees, it's that they were consistent. Then not much had changed in 2 years at all. They were still seething, still conniving, and still plotting to assassinate Paul. So they asked Festus as a favor to transfer Paul to Jerusalem, planning to ambush and kill him on the way. But Festus replied that Paul was at Caesarea and he himself would be returning there soon. So he said, "Those of you in authority can return with me. And if Paul has done anything wrong, you can make your accusations." Thankfully, and divinely, Festus grants a trial but denies a transfer. The Jews only wanted to move Paul to Jerusalem so that they could attempt to kill him en route again. But Festus denied this request and instead invited the accusers to make their case in Caesarea, where Paul was already in prison. No transfer needed. Now, about 8 or 10 later, Festus finishes up his work in Jerusalem, returns to Caesarea, and on the following day, again, not wasting any time, he took his seat in court and he ordered that Paul be brought in. When Paul arrived, the Jewish leaders from Jerusalem gathered around and made many serious accusations that they couldn't prove. Paul denied the charges. "I'm not guilty of any crime against the Jewish laws or the temple or the Roman government," he said. And then Festus, wanting to please the Jews, asked him, "Well, are you willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there?" So we need to actually cut Festus a little bit of slack here, because the guy had walked into a mess. The Jews were notoriously hard to govern. They were not an easy people to manage. And so making a good impression on their leaders was a priority for Festus. He had a very hard job ahead of him bringing peace and order to this province. And so in order for his newest appointment to go well, Festus had to be strategic in his first steps about who he catered to, the connections he made, because these selections could impact his ability to avoid riots and unrest in the future. Clearly, Festus was caught up in a political game, trying to align with those who would serve his leadership well in the future. So we asked if Paul would consider granting the request of the Jews, which was simple enough, to go to Jerusalem. But it's likely he didn't know that they were trying to kill Paul along the way. Now, thankfully, as we've gone through different chapters through Acts, there's one thing that has saved Paul time and time again throughout all these trials. Paul's Roman citizenship proves invaluable, absolutely invaluable, because Paul was protected by the Roman legal system. And it was for that reason alone that Festus couldn't actually order Paul to go. It had to remain a request. And so Paul replies, and he says, "Nope, I'm not going to Jerusalem. This is the official Roman court, so I ought to be tried right here. You know very well I'm not guilty of harming the Jews. If I have done something worthy of death, I don't refuse to die. But if I'm innocent, no one has the right to turn me over to these men to kill me. I appeal to Caesar." Paul went straight for the cutthroat here. He bypassed any middle management, and he used his coveted rights as a Roman citizen to bring his case before Caesar himself. Festus undoubtedly was kind of knocked back by this statement and this request, and so he conferred with his advisors, probably kind of having a little bit of a powwow sesh, and then he replied, "All right, very well. You have appealed to Caesar, and to Caesar you will go." Now, this was a particularly brilliant move on Paul's part. And honestly, it was probably a sigh of relief for Festus because he didn't have to make a decision. And here's why. The Roman legal system was complex and intricate. It did well to ensure justice for Roman citizens and those who had money. There were a few stages that a trial would progress through the system. The first stage, if there was a case or an accusation brought against you, is that you would first try to resolve this in your local people's own government. So remembering that Rome ruled over a vast variety of people groups, each one had its own set of cultural laws and traditions. And for the Jews, their governing body was the Sanhedrin, which if you've been following along in Acts with us, you're familiar with that term. It's the Jewish high court. Now, ideally, most cases were resolved by whatever each people's own government was, and the Romans wouldn't even have to get involved. However, as you might remember, Paul's appeal before the Jewish High Council did not go well. It resulted in an angry mob, and that did force the Romans to step in, because having an angry mob under Roman rule was not a good thing. So Paul was next brought to trial under the local city's Roman praetor. Now, we read about this in Acts 21. Usually a praetor was a Roman centurion who had risen through the ranks. They were responsible for governing the city and resolving basic legal matters. Paul's case wasn't basic though, was it? Because no one could find fault with him. No one had anything to convict him of, rightfully. Yet, there was a bloodthirsty mob demanding his death. And so the praetor decided to punt Paul off to the next in charge, the governor. And this was where we met Felix. Felix was the provincial governor of that time, and his role included acting as a magistrate for the more complicated trials across the whole province. Now, the governor was very high up in the power scale. He ruled over all the various cities, that is, province included, and he was regarded as the highest magistrate of legal jurisdiction. He had the final say, but the governor was trumped in power by Caesar himself. And this was the person Paul appealed to. Are you all with me? Just took you through a lot of context, but I hope it'll be helpful in understanding exactly what it is that's happening right here. So I'm going to continue on. Paul appealed to Caesar for a significant reason, and here is that reason. He had been through the gauntlet of various levels of authority. Each one was not sure what to do with him, and he came to see and discover that anyone who was reliant on Jewish favor was not going to grant him a fair trial. Anyone who needed the Jews to obey them and to have their favor was not going to grant Paul a fair trial because the Jews were against Paul. So Paul instead appealed to someone removed from that. He pulled the trump of all trumps, really. By appealing to Caesar, Paul would not only be given the chance at a fair trial finally, but he would also continue to remain under Roman guard. And that would keep him safe from the Jewish leaders' assassination attempts. This was the perfect play at the perfect time. It was masterful, and likely not something anyone really saw coming. I mean, even Festus had to take a minute and collect himself when Paul showed his hand. How in the world did Paul pull this off? I mean, let's think for a minute about the situation he was in. He was in the middle of angry people throwing false accusations at him, standing before an unfamiliar, brand new magistrate in defense of his life. Yet somehow, Paul's faith and his focus was not shaken. He knew where he needed to be, and that was Rome. And really, what better way to get to Rome than with a free soldier escort, right? Genius, absolutely genius. How in the world did Paul have such a level head? How did he not crumble into the sea of turmoil that was spinning all around him? How did Paul remain steady when his life was so far from stable? In a flash, Paul's circumstances changed again. And I gotta say, Paul must have become the most flexible, adaptable human being after meeting Jesus ever. Because think about where he came from. Paul's foundation and his upbringing was as a Pharisee. He was a Pharisee. He was a Jewish religious leader. He was highly devout. And for him, his life was routine. The Pharisees were not known for their flexibility and adaptability. They prided themselves on unwavering commitment to ancient traditions and rituals. For them, it was the same thing every day, every hour, every day, all the traditions without end. Then in a flash, literally, Paul's life in its entirety, his purpose, his mission, his home, his friends, his goals, his future, his understanding, his routine, it all went into a blender and then came out as a brand new reality. And Paul just ran with it. I wish I could say that I would respond the same way. I wish I could say that I'd stay calm and steady even when my world was spinning around me and God put it all in a blender. I wish I could say that I would keep my cool. But unfortunately, some of the turbulent seasons of my life would say otherwise. So often when my world has become unstable, I've become unstable too. I think of all this change that Paul endured and pressed through, and I realize I have got a lot of work to do, because even the most basic changes can be daunting. About a year and a half ago, our family moved into a new neighborhood, and the house we moved into itself was a bit of an adjustment, but one of the challenges about this move that I didn't expect was the difficulty of navigating a new neighborhood. Right? When you're in a neighborhood that you know where everything is, you know how to get to everything, and it's all fairly predictable. But now I had to find my new local stores and get familiar with their layout. I had to find new routes to work. I had to discover which gas stations were nearby, local restaurants, new parks for the kids, new running trails. I mean, it was such a basic adjustment, but it took me months to figure it out. Months of feeling lost, unfamiliar, like an outsider. This was such a minor change, but I'd be lying if I didn't tell you I had times where I struggled to feel at ease with it. I just wanted things to be the way they were before, known, familiar, predictable. What made it a little bit worse at the time was that we moved right before Christmas. And aside from navigating this new neighborhood, we actually had to start renovating the house as soon as we moved in. And so we were living with ripped up subfloor and holes in walls and paint cans everywhere. And that was our Christmas scene. Instead of the more structured, traditional planned day that Christmas usually is, we did manage to set up a Christmas tree, but it was on the subfloor with no decorations, and we called it good. It was a messy season. It really was. There were so many changes that flew at us at once. And I think this is why the word change is only 3 letters away from becoming the word challenge. Anybody feel that way sometimes? A change doesn't even need to be major to make us feel like everything's spinning. And I know for me, sometimes I wish things would just stop moving. Have you ever tried? Like, we know we can't stop the world from spinning, but have you ever tried? We just get dizzy. It doesn't work. It reminds me of an article that I recently read about the International Space Station. I was really surprised as I was reading this article to find what the most dangerous part of a space mission was. Because I would assume it was the takeoff and the landing, right? There's a lot of things that have to go right so people don't burn up. But I came to find out the most dangerous part of a space mission is a spacewalk. Anytime an astronaut has to complete a task outside the vehicle, it's called a spacewalk or an EVA, an extravehicular activity. And these EVAs, they're so dangerous, not only because the astronaut is outside the protection of the vehicle, but because the entire environment around the astronaut is constantly moving. It's constantly spinning. Not only are they in orbit quickly, they're making a full cycle around the Earth every 90 minutes, they're also getting pulled in multiple directions due to a lack of gravity. And it's in this situation and in this environment that they have to have a clear enough head to somehow maintain crucial tasks to the vessel. These are tasks that could threaten their own life or those of their coworkers. So how do astronauts stop the world from spinning? Well, they don't. They can't. Instead, they embrace their spinning world, which incidentally is actually what's keeping them in orbit, and they find their stability in a tiny little piece of equipment called a tether. This little tether alone is what keeps them steady as the world around them and they themselves are quite literally spinning. They anchor themselves to what they know they can trust. And it's this, of all things, that actually helped me to understand Paul so much more. Because this is what kept Paul from spinning out of control too. 2,000 years earlier than it was invented. And what I mean is that when life continues to spin around us, we need a trustworthy tether. We need a God tether. And this is why, because God is unchanging. Hebrews 13:8 says, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. James 1:17 says, whatever's good and perfect is a gift coming down to us from God our Father, who created all the lights. He never changes or casts a shifting shadow. When we tether to the unchanging, the world can spin away because we know where we are, and most importantly, we know whose we are. God is everlasting. Isaiah 26:4 says, trust in the Lord always. The Lord God is the eternal rock. God is never going to disconnect that tether from his end. We might try, we might even succeed, but he never will. God never tires out. Isaiah 40:28. Have you ever heard? Have you never understood? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of all the earth. He never grows weak or weary. No one can measure the depths of his understanding. It doesn't matter how fast our world spins. His strength is enough for us. And God's love for us is unconditional. Jeremiah 31:3 says, long ago, the Lord said to Israel, I have loved you, my people, with an everlasting love. With unfailing love, I have drawn you to myself. You know, it doesn't matter how far into the ether we drift, because God is always right there when we're ready to choose him. God is the unshifting constant we need in a world that is constantly shifting. Psalm 62 says it beautifully. It says, let all that I am wait quietly before God, for my hope is in him. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress where I will not be shaken. I got a visual of this a couple days ago on Friday. God kind of spoke to me. And of course, I didn't realize it until the day after, but I got there eventually. Our family went on a hike with Jason and baby Kellen to a place called Beacon Rock. Has anyone ever been to Beacon Rock? It's in Stevenson, Washington. Okay. Yes, one has been there. It's a really unique hike because the entire journey is this gradual ascension up an 848-foot rock face. The whole hike is making your way up and back down this huge basalt mass. And, you know, we had fun winding our way up. It was weaving. The way you get there is by weaving back and forth through a series of bridges and carved paths. And I've got a couple pictures. Those are my daughters as they were making their way up the different trails. And then the next one, you can see you're on the edge of this cliff. And it's quite jagged and a bit intimidating, but we got to the top and we took some pictures to prove it, of course. And then we really enjoyed our way back down because downhill is always easier than uphill, of course. And as we went, we were marveling at the amount of work that must have gone into making these trails and bridges because the rock itself, as you saw, was pretty daunting. I mean, it was 848 feet tall and it was made from eroded volcanic material. So the edges were really jagged and it looked like if you just grabbed onto it, you just fall. It looked a lot like Mordor. So if you're a Lord of the Rings fan, you know what I'm talking about. Now, as we got to the bottom and we started walking back, we came around to a different side of the rock, and what we saw was a rope dangling that looked like from somewhere in the clouds. Because standing at the bottom, we couldn't see where it actually attached to. It was attached somewhere at the very top. But it was so high that we couldn't see where, if you were to start climbing this rope, where it would even lead you to. We just saw a huge rock and then this tiny little rope. And we realized, like, this rope was for anyone who wanted to seriously climb the rock, the hardcore ones. But it looked almost impossible because this thin rope was the only route up the side of this massive boulder. And as I looked closer, I saw these little metal bolts that had been installed in the rock face. And they were there so that even though those climbing couldn't see the top, couldn't see the arrival point of where that rope led to, they could at least anchor into the bolts along the way. And that would keep them steady as they worked their way up. And you know, that made me realize how much that can feel like our life with God. So many times it might feel like he invites us on this journey, this ascension of working towards our best selves, our best lives, and it can feel like we're just dangling on the side of a mountain. Like we're doing our best to keep climbing, doing our best to keep handling each new level's challenges and changes with grace, but we don't really even know where it is that we're going to end up. And sometimes it can feel impossible. But do you know that God has given us anchor points along the way? Those anchor points are the promises that he makes us. The promises of God are the anchor for our soul. They are the tether we have to our unshakable rock. His promises can keep us from losing our footing when the world around us shifts, can keep us steady when our circumstances are not, can keep us focused when we lose sight of what's ahead, can keep us stable even when our situation changes. And if you've been in church any amount of time, chances are you've heard a few of these promises. There are over 7,000 promises in the Bible that God makes to his people. And this is what they sound like. No weapon formed against you will prosper. God works everything out for good for those who love him. We will have challenges, but nothing we face in this world has the power to overcome us. Those are both a promise, by the way. God will provide for his children. If you seek wisdom, you're going to find it. God will provide ways out of temptation when you need it. God is a good God. His intentions are for us to live our best life. You were made with a purpose, and your life is not a mistake. You are never alone. He's always with you. You have access to his power. He will finish the transformational work he started in you. These promises can be an anchor for our soul if we choose it. I'm going to invite the worship team to come back up. So I have a question for you today, and chances are it's obvious and you've already been asking yourself this question. But the question is, what is your tether connected to? What is your tether connected to? What or whose promises have you anchored your life to? There are all kinds of promises out there. Everyone has something to offer you. But what will you choose today? Here's what I've come to know and trust. God is an individual God with individual promises. Along with the promises to all his children in the Bible, he speaks to us personally too. And God promised Paul that he would speak in Rome. And Paul tethered to that promise. And because of that, Paul was able to withstand turmoil and unrelenting chaos because he knew that God would fulfill that promise. What was the last thing God spoke to you? Is he speaking to you today? We know we live in an uncertain, unstable world, but that doesn't mean we need to be uncertain, unstable people. We can be secure. We can be consistent. We can even be at peace if we choose to anchor ourselves to the promises of the one who never changes, our rock. Just imagine the peace and the security we'll experience as we make God's promises the tethers that they're intended to be. Imagine the security we'll be able to offer others as we remain stable while the world around us shifts. Let me pray for us today.